It's the Redbird Reboot podcast. Are you ready to get rebooted, Cardinals fans? He settles down, at least in the zone, and does not stop running.
Blake Murphy.
This is the identity for the Arizona Cardinals.
The run defense is just horrendous, and it's been horrendous for the Cardinals for a long time.
And Marcos Labrada.
He's going to bring over his philosophy. It should make it better.
Present the hottest NFL podcast from the country's hottest state.
He should be turning around the logo.
Actually, some breaking news we can cover here. This popped up just about, 6 minutes ago.
It's Redbird Reboot.
Hello, Arizona Cardinals fans. Welcome in. It's the Redbird Reboot podcast. I'm Blake Murphy on Twitter, X at Blake Murphy7. You can also find at Joe Comeau 13. I'm also on Blue Sky. I just have to log back into my phone, but that'll be the same thing here. Joe is known as the Cardinal Rule on YouTube, and he's been a long-time guest on our show, long-time Cardinals fan. And we're going to be talking about some pretty fun stuff today because the NFL draft is like the reality show of the NFL, where you have all the speculation, all of the different stock up, stock down. And it's fun because nobody loses any games, so everyone feels like they're a winner at the end of it. As we get into that, Joe, how are you doing at this point during the off season in which there's no football being played, but plenty of football fans still begging for content?
I mean, draft season's my favorite time of year. I have a good friend who will text me every year and say Merry Christmas when the draft's here because he knows that's my sports Christmas. So as we get close to the draft, I'm doing, I get excited, I get ramped up, and maybe some of that speaks about what it's been to be a Cardinals fan. Hope springs eternal, but the actual play has not necessarily been there. So the draft is our Super Bowl, sadly, for way too many years. But no, I'm excited with the draft coming up. Monty going into his third draft. He's, he has a couple years under his belt of really having his system in place. Excited to see what he does. And what's really intriguing to me this year is there's less certainty about what he's doing in the first round. Right. I mean, when they took Paris Johnson Jr., maybe we all thought that they're going a different direction position wise, but we had that was still on the radar. We all knew Marvin Harrison Jr. seemed like the pick last year. And this year, we've got ideas, but there's a lot of uncertainty. He might zig when we think he's going to zag. So there's a lot of intrigue. So I'm doing it well. So aside from the allergies that are ruining my life, I am well. How are you, Blake Murphy?
Oh, man. It's been one of the stranger off seasons because, like you said, this is the first year in a while the Cardinals do not have a top 5 pick, which means that there could be anywhere from 15 players gone to the Cardinals trading back yet again. Mm-hmm. Whereas in previous years, it's like, all right, do you trade? Do you take the player? Do you trade? Do you take the player? Do you take Marvin or all? It's just, the conversations were easier. Now it's more of you've got multiple positions of need, multiple different philosophies, and after a free agency where Arizona was able to address pretty much the majority of the largest needs that they had, you still have some needs at key areas, and it's going to be interesting to see what Mania does. So as we get into that, you've got your almighty chart in front. Those of you who guys have followed or viewed Joe before know what this is. But Joe, if you could explain this for people who are looking at this going like, all right, I see numbers. It kind of looks like a Wordle puzzle. Like maybe I need to solve this Sudoku. Like what do we have going on here as we get into talking about the draft?
So I published this with a video a couple of years back when the Cardinals first hired Monty Ossenfort. I was wondering what kind of draft strategy should we anticipate? And then I thought, let's look at the places where he kind of cut his teeth, those formative experiences, the organizations where he worked in the front office and kind of learned their philosophy. Obviously, he's his own man. He's going to, take some of his own kind of ideas into stock. But generally speaking, he probably gained the foundation of his philosophy from the places he learned, right, where he worked. So I looked at his career history, and he had been with the Patriots for quite a while as a scout. But I took it from the point where he first got what I would think of as a front office job, right, like director of scouting and those kinds of jobs and assistant GM jobs. So from 2011 through 2019, he held roles like that in New England, and 2020 through 2022 in Tennessee. And so the original chart that I published was looking at which positions did those front offices pick in which rounds to just kind of create sort of a heat map that says, here's some patterns, right? And the one I always talk about, folks that follow my content know, like when we all wanted John Michael Schmidt, and I love John Michael Schmidt, right? I looked at it, I was like, they don't take interior offensive linemen before day 2, right? In fact, before round 3, right? And in fact, you see on that chart for round 3, interior offensive line, that second one was Isaiah Adams. So they had only taken 1 in round 3. So as much as I love John Michael Schmidt, he was a late first round, early second round kind of prospect. I had to say, I don't think they're going to take him, and they didn't, right? So what this did is give us kind of an idea of these patterns to look at. And then you'll see on this one, I have it through 2024. So I've added his own picks in there. And as time goes on, I'll create versions of this that are just his picks when he has more years under his belt. But for now, it gives us idea of patterns. And there's a couple interesting ones, like the cornerback, right? They really like to take them on day 2 and then in the last couple rounds. And where have they drafted their cornerbacks, Mr. Blake Murphy, since he's been in the Cardinals front office?
Yeah.
Round 2, round 3, round 6, right?
Round 6.
And 7, right? So like
Oh,
that.
they did the 7th, that's right.
Right. Like the Mr. Relevant, right? So so I created this. So this is just a nice little way to kind of look at it. And again, they've broken the mold at points. They took a tight end in round 3 last year. That had not been on the chart before, right? But they still kind of take the middle rounds and later, right? So those patterns are still relevant. So I think this is just a really neat way to look at where Monty learned how to draft and kind of what kinds of philosophies is he likely to employ in terms of which positions you take where. So in my TCR Discord and in live streams, we jokingly call it the almighty chart. If your mock draft violates the almighty chart, we accuse you of heresy, and I'll praise be the chart. It's a fun inside joke, but it really is, I think, insightful way to look at this and kind of get some clues. In the absence of knowledge of exactly what he's going to do, these kinds of clues can at least help you narrow down when you're doing your own mock drafts.
No, absolutely. That's something that I think is really key to remember as well, is that some general managers don't go ahead of type because they don't have the player that's going to be there. Others, it'll just be kind of that they've got their tendencies. And so balancing out, like, there's a thing called survivorship bias, which is like, hey, the Cardinals haven't drafted a quarterback under Monty in the first round. And guess what? They haven't drafted one when he was with the Titans or with the Patriots. Having a Tom Brady and a Kyler Murray is part of that, so you don't have to really look at that. That's where you can say, well, doesn't mean they're going to take one this year, like at 16 overall, but you're able to at least recognize that for the most part, people will kind of stick with some of their trends that they have. Like, the thing I remember about Steve Keim was he spent a lot on off-ball linebackers. He drafted several that were kind of tweener positions over the years, from Buchanan to Reddick to Collins. He drafted one inside offensive lineman and then never again. In the first 2 rounds, he drafted one cornerback, and this is counting his time as the scouting director in 2011 with Patrick Peterson, and then only took 2 day 2 picks for cornerbacks for the rest of his tenure. One they traded away, and the other was a running back turned cornerback. And then when it came to receiver, he spent a first rounder in a trade, multiple second rounders, a 4th rounder, 3rd rounder, John Brown. So you can see where a lot of the preferences have been compared to Monty. He's drafted a lot of tight ends ultimately in day 3, 4, 5, and 6, but not any of them early. They inherited an early one in Trey McBride, but yes. That's where what you're saying, you can see some things that match up with what Monty has done with the Patriots that match up pretty well with what we've seen him do with the Cardinals, and those would probably be the green shaded boxes that have 5 or 6 or more on your chart.
They love linebackers around 6, and Papo, I think he was 5 or 6. He was somewhere around there, right? And the other pattern I would just note before we go on is, as much as I've always been a believer in take running backs in day 3, and because what we've all talked about for years, you can find good running backs around 4 and 5. Patriots like to take them early, right? Day 1 and 2, and sometimes in the 4th round and early day 3. And, Monty's drafted one running back, but he was in the 3rd round, right? So they're going to take running backs a little earlier than some organizations. They're going to not take interior offensive line early. They seem to love them around 4. Those are the patterns I look for, especially when you see, like you said, those really green spots. And when if you look at edge, they take him everywhere, but they like round 3, right? Wide receiver everywhere. So there's harder to find a pattern there. They're going to take them all over the place, but those cornerbacks and linebackers late, right? And running backs early, those kinds of patterns to me are the ones that I pay the most attention to with this.
Yeah, no, the thing that I think makes a lot of sense also for Arizona Cardinals fans to look at is going to be, we already seen them take multiple corners in the 2nd round. Cornerbacks is something that they had to address because they didn't really have as much of a cornerback system coming into the 2023 season. If you guys remember, cornerback 1 was Marco Wilson, and he clearly was not a cornerback 1 and ended up being cut from the team. So that's something where there can be a combination of needs that you're drafting for as well as value and talent. But like you said, one of the things that we'll see is that they'll spend capital on wide receivers and tackles, and then they'll spend day 2 capital on running backs, especially with round 2 and round 4, as well as round 3 edge rushers. And then, like you said, linebacker and corners. Part of the reason why they take so many of those in round 6 and 7 is specifically special teams use. Like, those are your core special teams players. And we have not seen Monty draft a kicker. God forbid that they draft a long snapper. Like, that would be one of the biggest wastes of a pick you could possibly make, I think, would be to take in a long snapper. But the interesting case that comes with this year for Cardinals fans is there's a bit of a split about which position they should go, because it seems like 2 years in, we don't have people who are saying we need to draft a quarterback. We don't have people who are really looking at those top places. There's a little bit of discussion over if the Cardinals could take a wide receiver, but a lot of it seems to be the core position of building the trenches with occasionally someone wanting a wide receiver or a corner. And that really is kind of what the league is. If your running backs are set, if you don't necessarily have a need for a star linebacker in your system, which is we've seen under Jonathan Gannon, like they'll take one occasionally early enough, but for the most part, it's not going to be something that they're going to invest too heavily in. And we've seen that the lines, as far as the offensive line, well, good for the Cardinals last year. The defensive line, a lot of injuries, needed some work. Most of the mock drafts that we've been able to see have kind of tracked the Arizona Cardinals taking a defensive lineman. And some changes have popped up in more recent times. Like, there's been a couple we can talk about for other players mocked, but it does feel like part of this is a defensive line draft. There's a lot of first-round names, a lot of first-round edge rushers. Not as many people seem to be looking at the offensive side of the ball, and that may matter because the last 2 years, Cardinals have drafted an offensive player in the first 2 rounds. Do you think that it's more likely that they could follow with that pattern because of where things could stack up and how Monty drafts? Or is this kind of the year that we do see a partner to go along with Adarius Robinson on the defensive side?
I've really wrestled with that. In most of my mock drafts, I end up going defensive tackle in the first round. That feels like the big need. If you look at the almighty chart, they have taken a couple early, but then they like to wait after that. But you also see they don't take a lot of them. Now, some of that offset by the fact that some of those edges are 3 techniques. Guys like Darius Robinson, who they're not the 6'2", 320-pound defensive tackle, right? But they're still playing on the inside some, and they play a lot of versatile fronts there. So that's kind of where I've been going, and it makes sense that they've really tried to get the offense right and trusted their coaching to make the most of the defense, and then figured this would be the year to start really kind of investing in defense. That seems plausible and makes sense. And even when you look at the offense, like, they could use a speed receiver, they could use a player here or there, but like the major needs on offense are kind of all either addressed or they've got someone that they've drafted that you see as the future there that they're developing, right? Maybe you could argue you want an upgrade at right tackle. You want to draft a guy who is going to be that right tackle. But there's not a pressing need on offense aside from needing guys to develop that they've drafted. So it feels like defense makes a lot of sense. And if I had to go with the safe bet, yeah, I think it is either a defensive tackle or maybe an edge. Obviously, signing Josh Sweat kind of maybe brings that need down a little bit, at least in the first round. But I got to tell you, like, in the back of my head, there is just a sinking feeling that Monty's going to go like, out of left field, like wide receiver or offensive tackle.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the positions I keep thinking. And that's, to me, again, defensive tackle makes sense. It's what I would want to do. But there's just part of me that feels like they want to go defensive tackle later, right?
Yeah.
And that he's just going to do something that we didn't expect. Maybe that's just all those years of Kime, just kind of. But so my safe bet, my chalk bet is, yes, a defensive tackle, someone, like Kenneth Grant or someone like that. But there's just this part of me that can't get past this idea that they might go tackle or receiver there.
No, and that's something that we can talk about, because what we've seen with Steve Keim and his approach was very much a go for it every year sort of approach, where we would see, hey, the Cardinals need to compete this year. So what do? They're trading the second for Hopkins, and they're taking I think it was in the first round that year, unless I'm mistaken, that was the year that they took Isaiah Simmons, because they needed a defensive playmaker. Now, that was also the year where I looked at the wide receiver room and was saying, I don't care if you traded for Hopkins. I still think that getting Lamb back with Kyler makes sense, or just getting that right tackle. They were able to kind of address some of the needs with Beachum, getting Jones as the swing tackle, and Simmons ended up actually just not panning out the way that they had wanted. But it shows kind of where we'll talk about what you look at as process-oriented versus results-oriented, where we said always with Monty is he's got a different process than Steve Keim. He's going to have a multi-year process. We saw that the last 2 years where the Cardinals traded back, got an offensive tackle, and we're like, well, why are they grabbing an offensive tackle when, they've got a huge need to get in a pass rusher like a Will Anderson? And then we saw year past, moved on from DJ Humphries, Paris Johnson slid over to the other side. It was like, okay, so this is a multi-year type of build that's going on. There's no having to trade a first rounder away to get back Hollywood Brown, another third, so you can get that pass rusher that you need with the 2022 NFL draft. And part of that is when you don't have time and you need a contract extension, that's kind of where some of that desperation can kick in. A good example of a team like that this year would be the New York Giants, signing 2 quarterbacks and maybe drafting another one potentially, just because they're in like the last year of their deal, need to get that extension, or it'll be a brand new crew in there. I do think that when it comes to the approach, part of the reason why it could be an offensive player would be looking at the way that Monty has built the team. They've got a couple of guys signed through next year on 2-year deals. You've got Delvin Tomlinson's on a 2-year deal. Josh Sweat's on that 4-year deal, in which 2 of the years have guaranteed money. So you're talking about kind of a practical 2-year deal for both of those guys. So you're talking about having those guys for the next few years, having guys like Bilal Nichols and Justin Jones from last year under contract this year. So when we're talking about what are some of the biggest needs that could be upgraded or replaced, you look at least at the depth chart, and the biggest one that stands out would be the 1-year deal for Kelvin Beachum, 1 year left in the 2-year deal for Jonah Williams, and a 5th-round pick in terms of, I want to say, it was Christian Jones being the one there.
Tackle.
And I have a question, like, is he the guy who maybe would go ahead and like take over or start? Is he a guy that's going to be like, a swing tackle? I think that it's hard to be able to say that a 5th-round pick is going to become a starter. With some exceptions, we've seen the Cardinals take veterans who worked out on other teams who are backups or undrafted, and kind of promote them to a starter, or like an Owen Papo of last year. Kaiser White was a 5th-round pick by the Eagles. But as far as it goes with Arizona, I'll pull up their depth chart here for those watching online. They have essentially the front of their offense for the most part is now set. If you see Isaiah Adams promoted into that right guard starting spot, That's something that could be the case for the year. He did get to start down the stretch. And then you're able to see Jonah Williams is the guy who has his contract up after this year. They've got a 2-year deal for Brown, for Furholt. When it comes to the tight end spot, you don't really have to worry about it for the long term because Trey McBride's going to get paid. Tip Ryman's going to get paid. You've got Travis Vokalek coming back in. The biggest area you can at least say then is the Cardinals on offense have everyone pretty much signed for the next 2 years. It really then is an eval year for Kyler Murray, and it's that right tackle spot where you're able to see that you've got one guy who's not going to be here next year in Christian Jones. That's where I think that with how this draft stacks up and how it plays out, you could argue the Cardinals could take a wide receiver, but when it's a 12 personnel type of offense and that it'd be kind of like you said, it'd be a Mania move that would be out of left field. We've already seen him take an offensive tackle early. I think that it's probably on the offensive side. I'd say at around one tackle or bust would probably be the case for an offense. What we're really going to want to look at is on the defensive side, knowing that they still need a playmaker at least somewhere off of the edge to probably go along with Sweat. They're probably going to need a number one cornerback, probably need a linebacker. There's pieces at each level of the defense, safety position notwithstanding, that could use an investment. And I think the Cardinals could draft 1 or 2 players potentially in the first few rounds at that spot. And defense is, I think, where we'll want to focus on when we're taking a look at what's most realistic. Like maybe there's what we would do, but in terms of what's most realistic, you got to think the Cardinals are going defense pretty early with at least 2 of their 3 top draft picks, I would argue.
Yeah, and you real quick going back, you mentioned the right tackle position, right, and Christian Jones, a 5th round pick, and one of the things I did when I was doing some of the research for the Monty kind of videos in terms of his draft strategy that led to the chart, and I did another one on offensive line, what kind of offensive lineman they probably going to be using for this type of offense. I looked at the Patriots offensive line draft history, and the Patriots didn't draft well at some positions. Their wide receiver drafting is some of the worst in the NFL historically, maybe the worst. There's a few other positions where they ain't been great, but offensive line, they were really good. And so one of the players that they drafted was a 5th round offensive tackle named Marcus Cannon, who became their right tackle. But I could also see them, going with an offensive tackle early to try to just really solidify that spot, especially if they want to be run heavy. But I do think besides that, they go really heavy on defense in general in the draft. And I do think they take at least one offensive lineman, whether it's a tackle early or an interior offensive lineman later, depending on how they feel about their future there. And receiver, I mentioned that, but I don't love this receiver class. And I feel like what they really need is a speed receiver. And those guys are going to go early. Maybe they can get one later, but they so that's where I wrestle with there. So I do think, the trenches, but I will say they haven't invested early picks in middle linebacker under Monty, but I could see them taking a linebacker maybe on day 2. The almighty chart says they have taken them in the first round, although it was late in the first round, and on day 2. And I could see them wanting to draft a guy to be that quarterback of the defense to develop into that. So that's a possibility. But yeah, I do think defensive tackle just seems like, with the Eagles, keep in mind Gannon's input comes into here, not just Monty's, right?
Yeah. They
liked taking those defensive tackles and taking them early, right? So that makes a lot of sense. And I'll let me throw just another one out there because it seems like it's not something they're going to draft, you would think, but I wouldn't be surprised if we get a safety somewhere. I know they took one last year. I know it's one of the strongest rooms on the team, but they have a lot of money invested in their 2 starting safeties. And that's not a premium position that you want to spend a lot of money on in terms of roster construction. And I think Monty pays attention to that. And I think that, and I love this player, but I think, that I think Buddha, when his contract ends, he may move on, right?
Yeah, he's
But
on a 2-year deal, I believe, with his extension, which will lock him up at least through like 31 years of age. And as we've seen with safeties, like the all-time great Adrian Wilson for the Cardinals retired, I think it was like 32 or 33 years old. And that's where, like, as we say, with running backs, safeties, even linebackers, sometimes you can hit the wall very quickly, whereas other
Right.
times you can adjust at positions, whether you'll see, the quarterback inside of a new system, like we were able to see with how Aaron Rodgers was able to see his career extended by moving out of that old West Coast offense into more of the play action under center, run heavy offense. And his efficiency went up. We also seen how Larry Fitzgerald kind of moved from the outside receiver role into kind of that big slot position under Bruce Arians, similar to how he had moved Reggie Wayne before him and Hines Ward before him. So those are things that you can also take a look at for longevity. I think that previously going into this season, I would have said that I would have thought Jalen Thompson would have been a potential draft day trade candidate to, hey, you draft a safety. You are able to roll with Adrian Taylor Demerson as a starting spot after getting experience last year. You have one of the best nickel corners in the game in Garrett Williams, who can also play some of that safety role. You got Max Melton, Elijah Jones, who are young. You've got like plenty of guys in the secondary. So it seemed to make some sense that maybe you would bring in a young safety, get some of that contract off the books. And then I saw what some of the safeties made in free agency this year. And I got to say, I'm probably not going to move on from a good safety in Jalen Thompson until the contract is up after seeing the capital that was spent. Like, it feels like Buddha's probably came back here because he wanted to be here. He could have gotten more on the free agent market. He just was able to accept kind of like that lifetime spot for the Cardinals and get a good deal at 29, turning 30 years of age. So I agree with you in that where the secondary seems like it is maybe more set, there could still be room for another addition.
Well, where I was going with that is actually Jalen Thompson. I think when his contract is up, I don't know that I love him as a player, but I think they're going to draft guys for that. So I think Rabbit is obviously going to be a starting safety when whichever the first one of those two moves on, right? Buddha or Jalen. Yeah. And I just have this bad feeling that within the next 2 years, both of them will be gone, and we'll have Rabbit and someone else they draft as a starter. Which I say a bad feeling because I love those players, but I get it from a roster perspective.
Right. From an age perspective, you'd have thought maybe you would have seen the Cardinals not extend Buddha, and they would have rolled with Jalen Thompson and Rabbit. But now you're looking at it, and they decided that Baker was too important to keep, and it's a void year next year for Jalen Thompson from that 3-year extension, which likely means that it's going to be his last year in Arizona. I don't see this team with drafting Rabbit and getting him starting reps keeping Thompson on the roster, especially when Thompson can go to another team in free agency and probably like he's getting his first large extension deal. This was Buda Baker's second deal. So that means that you're probably looking more for just trying to get us paid as much as you can. Like the first time when Buda made that contract, I remember people like, he doesn't have any interceptions. What are the Cardinals doing? And in hindsight, it's like, all right, they got one of their kind of emotional leader who backed it up his play on the field for what, in hindsight, with the cap going up, is a really good deal overall. He has basically played through that deal and earned a good enough second one. Let's go and talk a little bit here, looking at the overall NFL draft and this year, what it looks like in particular. So this is the Pro Football Focus big board, and the way that it stacks up, usually you'll see quarterbacks will be at the top. Usually you'll see an edge rusher be at the top. A lot of times there will be a playmaker, and then occasionally a really solid offensive tackle will usually crack the top 5. All of these are like the top positions of need. And then sometimes there's an exception that pops up. This year, they've got a unique exception in Travis Hunter, who is a young two-way player, won the Heisman Trophy this year. I have him as what I would play him at cornerback versus wide receiver and put him in kind of like a Patrick Peterson. But I think he's going to end up as a receiver at the next level because there's enough teams that like him at receiver. And I don't know if you've looked at the contracts that just got handed out to Jamar Chase and even with T. Higgins. There's a lot of money to be made as a top receiving threat where you might just be in that spot where you'd want to play him on both sides, like kind of one of those, I think they'd call them the old Iron Men who would play both ways. He is someone that's going to be really unique. You kind of follow it up with the top edge rusher who we'll see how if he needs surgery or not. And Abdul Carter, you've got PFF loves the top receiver this year, and to Tet McMillan out of a local school at University of Arizona. I know some Cardinals and U of A fans I've seen have like wanted to have him be the guy opposite of Marv. You've got two strong Michigan guys this year, and then the other Heisman runner in Ashton Gianti is up there as far as a possible top 10 running back who could go this year. Joe, I know that there's a little difference as far as for how much you've invested into like some of the Pacific players and some of it, but the one thing that you can see from this year that as this is a different draft from most is we go to the top 8, 9, almost going through 10 positions. There ain't no quarterback up there. This is a unique draft in that there's not a top consensus, top 10 talent overall quarterback, but there is a quarterback who seems likely to go number 1 overall to the Titans, or at least in the top 3 picks.
Yeah, it seems like, and I think a lot of people think that's probably Cam Ward, right? That seems like the most likely. And it's a good year not to be in the top 3 again, right? Because if you're the Cardinals and you haven't and you're not drafting a quarterback, you love being in that spot because you can trade. Aside from the fact that you have to lose games to get there, but the trade back draft capital. So if you're a team in the early rounds that doesn't need a quarterback, this is not a good year to be in those early rounds, right? Yeah. So yeah, and it's a weird quarterback class, probably not a great one. Someone is probably going to be good. I mean, Shedeur Sanders is such a question mark, right? Some things he does really well, but there's some questions about scheme and such. So yeah, I'm glad we're not having to look at a quarterback this year.
Yeah, that was one of the things Cardinals fans like trade Kyler. Like, okay, well, like if in a good quarterback class, you could maybe sell me on some stuff, even with the dead cap, if you think you're going to get a better player. But yeah, as we said, Sanders, the best case scenario for him is probably someone who he reminds me a lot of a Geno Smith, but Geno Smith's arm strength, as we've seen with his accuracy on deep balls, has been very good. There's a lot at the line. It's going to be interesting to be able to see how it plays out. I could still see him go as early as 3 to the Giants, and I could see the Giants trying to get him late first in a trade up at least, or him falling out of the first round entirely, depending on how things go. You've also got people who are kind of in that quest for quarterback 3 between fast guy and Jalen Milroe, who just has not had the accuracy. A good player in Will Howard, won a national championship. A guy in Jackson Dart, and this is like just context of following the draft as I have for years. I say anything at the combine, there's truth that comes out at the combine, and there's truth that comes out like 48 hours before the draft. A lot of that in between is going to be agents or other stuff that pops up or comes out that may not have like anything that actually does with where a guy goes or how his NFL success ends up being. You can take a look at least at a Laramie Tunsil on draft day of being like the best example of a guy who's had an almost 10-year career in the league, who had a video drop on draft day that saw him end up with the Dolphins. But for the quarterbacks this year, there always seems to be kind of guys will end up going. Sometimes it'll be a shock, like this guy went in the first round. Other times you'll end up recognizing a lot of guys will get late first round hype. Some guys will get starting hype. Very rarely do we see guys who are not really consensus first rounders actually go there. Sometimes you'll see a guy like a Jalen Milroe fall to like round 3 or round 4, depending on how teams have their boards. And as a result, it means that the Cardinals, you're hoping that Shedeur Sanders is able to go before you pick, because that gives you another talented player at a position of need that you don't have. The other thing that's strong about this draft that we can say is defensive line is very strong overall as far as when it comes to the edge defenders. You've got Carter, Mike Green off the edge. James Pierce ran a 4.4. You got someone who's probably one of my sleeper picks for the Cardinals, and no one would know him on draft day, but people would love him by like the end of his rookie season. A couple of other different athletic freaks, and you're also going to talk at least about some interesting straight up interior defenders, where you're going to have 2 guys out of Michigan, I want to say at least, and then there's some others that have some interesting cases, such as Walter Nolan. Derek Harmon is a name that's been mocked there a lot. Tyleik Williams, at least, is another one that you could probably look at if the Cardinals were to trade back. These are like some of the players and how it will pan out. What's interesting, too, about this class is it's a bit deeper on that defensive lineman class. It's also one of the best and deepest running back classes that we have seen, which for a Cardinals team that has their starter under contract in James Conner, and it has their backup and probably heir apparent in Trey Benson. Like, this is a spot that the Cardinals could address, but what's nice about it being a heavy running back class is that you're going to probably see a lot of these guys go in the first 3 rounds, some even in round 4. The Cardinals may not even take for that spot, which would make another position of need drop to you. So I know we're going to talk at least at the end of the show about everyone's favorite Arizona State running back, but for now, I think the easiest thing we can say is when you're a Cardinals fan, you're probably going to say, if I'm going to look for someone on the trenches, offense or defense, they're probably going to be there. The one thing that may not be there that's interesting is a cornerback, which is some people have bumped cornerback up in their rankings. I've seen several mock drafts with one of Jahdae Barron and Will Johnson there. Do you think that the Cardinals could or should go with a corner, considering how, like you've shown on the chart, they invested a lot of second-round picks, a third-round pick last year in Elijah Jones. They've signed guys in free agency. Do you think that it's still a position of need that should be the pick at 16, even over other places, because it'll be harder to find maybe that number 1 shutdown corner later in the draft?
I don't think so. And obviously Max Melton had his moments, but he was inconsistent. He was a rookie. Garrett Williams has been a revelation at slot corner, right? You can just, as long as he's healthy, you can lock him in there. And they had, the guy they drafted out of Boston College last year who was injured, who didn't even play. And I feel like they trust their ability to coach those guys up and develop them and get serviceable starting play out of them, and maybe even have someone take a step forward. I just think they want to kind of work through what they have in the room, right? And kind of figure that out, and if it doesn't work out, they can bring in someone in free agent as a bridge. But I feel like they want to focus on other areas, and you take into account, I think they're also, I would imagine, anticipating improved pass rush will help the cornerback play some as well. So they've invested so much draft capital in that cornerback room. Like, literally, if they draft someone else, they might have to cut someone who they haven't even seen enough of yet, right? Elijah Jones or someone like that, or at least try to get them through the practice squad, which they may or may not make it. Thank you, Silverwolf, with the comment. Yeah. So it just, to me, it feels like that room is too full with guys that they're trying to develop and see who rises to the top. So I feel like it makes more sense to go with the trenches. But to your point, you talked about the running backs being such a good draft class, potentially some of them going earlier than usual pushes guys down the board. And when I talked about earlier how, as much as I think interior defensive line, defensive tackles, that first round pick makes sense, the defensive tackle class is so good. And you look at it and you're like, okay, Kenneth Grant is a really nice player, right? Ranked at 17, and Walter Nolan's nice. But do they really like those guys that much more than someone they might be able to get in round 2? Yeah. With a deep class, and that class, maybe the other positions pushing that position down a little bit, maybe that really does mean they go with a position that they're not going to get as good of a player later, like tackle or receiver, right? And you do find a lot of good interior defensive linemen, like in round 2 and 3, right? They may not have as much pass rush, but you find guys that end up being really solid players there. So
I think I'm kind of in agreement with you. The other one I would want to look at ruling out potentially would be wide receiver, as far as there's been some mock drafts that have popped up. We've seen some people, most people seem to agree that Tet McMillan ran in the 4.5s. He's not going to test into, I wouldn't say that he'd be in my top 5 receivers of last year. Maybe like in hindsight, you could say he's in that Rome Odunze type of level. He's still very young. I also was much higher on Ladd McConkey last year than other people were, and it was just health was the biggest question, and he's really blossomed. So if you're talking about getting your wide receiver and you need one, last year is the year to get one. Cardinals already got one. We'll see exactly how it works out this year. But then some people question, could you then take a deep speed receiver such as a Luther Burden? Do you take a larger, maybe more than a slot guy, in Emeka Egbuka, who played with Marvin Harrison Jr. At Ohio State, is maybe not necessarily slot only, but he's a guy that probably has some flexibility, but would mostly be like your slot guy. I think that with him and Trey McBride, the skill set is going to be advantage McBride, and the Cardinals are not going to run as many 11 receiver sets as much as this running scheme. So that kind of leaves the guy in Matthew Golden, and then other guys who could be there later as far as like the size and speed and Jack Beck or Jaden Higgins at least, who was able to run down. The guy who at least was probably the fastest one would be Jalen Noel as far as a slot receiver. But these are guys with him and Trey Harris, not round one type of players. They're probably not even guys you trade back with. I think that it would be, like you said, good to take one of these guys, potentially could be a draft pick for the Cardinals, but it's not the most impressive receiver draft. Even a Tez Johnson, who's someone who was very productive at the college level, he's like weighed in at 155 pounds, and you're talking about a guy who's like smaller than a JJ Nelson. Maybe if you're going to say, hey, you take an Isaiah Bond in round 3 or round 4, maybe he gets bumped up to round 3 because of the speed. Okay, like there's some opportunity there. But at the same time, when we're talking about what the needs are for this team with the 12 personnel, if you told me that the Cardinals could get another pass-catching tight end to kind of draft and develop who has athleticism, that kind of could be, hey, if Trey McBride goes down, we can block with this tight end, we can run routes with this tight end, kind of like, the pseudo version of what they have now with Elijah Higgins. I'd probably almost rather take that in a round 3 or round 4, knowing how much these tight ends will play over a speedy deep threat receiver. It just kind of will vary sometimes based off of, how much volume. And at the same time, they have not had that deep, speedy receiver. And we saw last year their vertical game kind of was dependent on Marvin Harrison Jr. and Michael Wilson. Being able to add someone who can get some separation over the top would be something I think you'd want, but I don't see a combination of that for the team need, nor at that talent level available at the receiving position. So let's. Oh yeah, go for it. What were you about to say?
I was just saying, I agree with you, and I've said this a lot of times before, and you said it in different words. Their offense is going to be so run heavy, so tight end. There's only so many targets, and I always compare it to the Baltimore Ravens, where like a lot of running and a lot of tight end targets, and then you just don't have a major receiver in that offense that gets tons and tons of targets. So Harrison and McBride are going to be the target getters, and with the rest of your receivers is you need guys that play a role. Michael Wilson, nifty route runner who can be a possession receiver, who can get separation and is not going to get tons of targets, but can make good things happen. You have Dortch, who is that shifty slot guy, right? What you don't have is that take the top off the defense threat. So when you look at what they need in receiver, I think there are two types of receivers they actually could use in this offense. A speed guy doesn't even have to be great with his hands. He just literally needs to be a guy that you say run to the end zone and the safety can't let you go because you can't get a free release on that. And then I think, with Dortch, as much as we love him, how long is he going to be here? He's not on a long-term contract. Maybe they want to get, as much as I hate to say this, an upgrade in terms of a future slot, right? So it's a slot or a deep speed guy, but the speed guy is not going to be a target monster, right? So those are not guys you draft early. Right. That's what I'm saying. So unless so as much as I've been saying, I have this bad feeling it's going to be a tackle receiver. If it's receiver, it's because they decide to just go all in on the best speed guy they can get early. Right. Yeah. But I think it's more likely that if they go receiver, it's late because you can get those slot guys late, or you can get a guy on early day 3 who has speed, but not a lot else going for him.
No, I totally agree there. Those are reasons where they could go, but I think at least if we're trying to like gauge where the draft chart goes off of stuff where Monty drafts normally, the place where we'll probably want to start is what we've seen him already do, which is offensive line. We've seen the Cardinals find some guards late. We've seen them kind of use center and guard as interchangeable. Like we got to see Evan Brown play a little bit of center or be the backup center in case of Froholt going down. But we haven't seen the Cardinals invest really early in terms of a guard, which brings up at the top of our draft, there's been some questions about the arm length of Will Campbell, whether he's a guard or a tackle. I think that he's going to be probably the most likely player to go top 5 of any of those, and he'll probably get the tryout at tackle first. Armand Membo is the biggest riser in terms of he just blew up the combine and really showed at least that he's got a lot of length. So these are guys who are probably going to be off the board before the Cardinals pick. And when it comes to like with centers or even with guards, the one guard that is kind of given a first round consensus is Tyler Booker out of Alabama at 325. But when you watch him play, he's a little bit more like I think of Chance Warmack is like the best comparison. A little smaller, but not by much. He doesn't have the same as far as athleticism of running around, but like he'll just open holes for you in the run game. With how much Arizona has run counter, which is where essentially their guard, their tackle, one of the players will pick up, run to another side, and then hit the incoming defensive lineman or edge rusher to kind of open up space. That's like their bread and butter play because you can then bring different guys. It's unpredictable. And then with having a back with vision like James Conner, he can then just follow some of the blocks that are there to get downfield. I don't have Booker necessarily as a fit. And so as a result, if you wanted to say, hey, Cardinals, maybe they get a uber talented guard, break Mania's rule 1 year. I don't see the fit with the player for each of those yet, which would mean that you're probably looking at pure tackle. So now who are the guys that have popped up the most? Well, we've seen Josh Simmons and Kelvin Banks Jr. are the two that have been most mocked to the Arizona Cardinals. And one of those in particular, in Josh Simmons, has been mocked there the most because there's familiarity with him and a new coach on the Arizona Cardinals coaching staff. So Cardinals went out and got the Ohio State Buckeyes offensive line coach to be their own offensive line coach this year, replacing the likes of, I want to say Clayton Adams, who went away to the Dallas Cowboys. So it'd be offensive line coach Justin Fry. Now, I wish that this is an ACL tear in 2024 that Simmons is coming off of. It's actually a little bit worse as far as a patellar tendon. And what we've seen and most people or consensus have said is that he probably would be one of those guys who goes in the top 10 if not for the injury. And he went out, Donovan Jackson, who's another player that is an interior guy for Ohio State. We talk about Ohio State linemen because Cardinals already have one in Paris Johnson. Between him and then Kelvin Banks Jr., a guy who at least is moved really well, great run blocker, maybe not the longest arms, but he's someone who at least has been consistent. He's the kind of guy who you start him at tackle like a Calvin Beecham potentially could stick on that line for a long, long time. We've seen some of Mock Zabel there, but as an interior guy versus as a tackle, I think while they like guys who have that flexibility, as we've seen, when it comes to tackles, like Monty doesn't mess around. He traded back and wasn't content to just take whichever tackle was there. He made an aggressive move up for him. So part of where I've said I lean right now that would make some sense is if you say, all right, Simmons is probably not going to be playing to start the year with this injury. Kelvin Banks could. I know he got nicked up in the, I want to say the college playoff games. But these are guys who could come in, potentially start at one of the guard spots or be on the bench for the most part with the likes of Beecham in there, with Jonah Williams. We'll see what his status is like after he missed most of last year with multiple injuries. This would be probably, at least at the pick 16, two that would make some sense to me. And the only two picks, I think, on the offensive side that would really click, I think, for the Cardinals would be if they say, hey, we're going to have bookend tackles for the future. It fits with our ability to run the ball, our scheme, being able to invest at premium positions, and being able to recognize that it's a lot harder to find a starting right tackle. If Cardinals let Jonah Williams walk, say that they don't take an offensive tackle this year, you're probably going to be paying someone next year to be in that spot, or you're going to be drafting a guy to start, and you don't know if the Cardinals are picking high, if they're picking low in the draft after a playoff run. It feels kind of like this would be a long-term sort of move if they took Simmons and trusted the medicals, and probably a short-term type of move of getting a guard in that spot pretty quickly in Banks Jr. or a tackle to be able to kind of fill in depending on how the health goes. It just isn't quite the biggest need for the Cardinals, but it's one that, at least if we're going to say that there's a move they could make that would make sense for the long term in a deep defensive tackle draft, it'd probably be one of these two guys.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. And I think, based on all the research I did for the almighty chart and the Monty draft history, looking at the Patriots stuff, they don't take those guys in the first round that are going to have to move into guard. If they're going first round, they're going a tackle who they anticipate will stay at tackle. Those guys, that were tackles in college that move inside, they take on round 3, like Isaiah Adams, right? And they had the plan to move him to guard. So I think Simmons and Banks make a lot of sense for all the reasons you said. But someone who is going to end up long-term moving inside. I don't think that happens. And I guess I would, even though we saw that with, prior to Monty, the Cardinals doing that, moving, guys inside, Josh Jones to guard. I think if they draft him at tackle, I don't think they're going to mess around with that. I think they're going to stick him at tackle. And if they're not starting, then they're going to get practice reps and they're going to start the next year. But at the same time, like when they've drafted tackles, and even when you look back at the Patriots, when they've drafted tackles early, they drafted them to start. That makes me now wonder, as much as I think tackle is the position they could go with in the first round, if they're more likely to get a guy on day 2 or 3 so that between him and Christian Jones, one of those two guys is going to work out. Like, a guy I look at is Wyatt Millum out of West Virginia. He's 6'6", 317. His arms are long enough. He's more of a run blocker, which is what they want to do. He's played left tackle, move him to right tackle, right? Someone like that who's maybe not as good as a pass blocker, but you move him to right tackle, develop him. Someone like that you can get maybe in the 3rd round. Might be more the direction they go for that tackle situation. But we haven't really talked about this. And what I think is absolutely high possibility, if not probability, is a trade back, because we didn't talk about this much, but the Patriots loved trading back, especially getting 2nd round picks. And you've probably seen it. There was a research article years ago that talked about the 2nd round picks in terms of like value are actually some of the best values of performance to cost or what have you.
Right.
There was an analytics article published on that. And the Patriots really seem to take that to heart. And then what you also do is, obviously, when you trade back and you gain future picks, there's always, you get them, there's an increase in the value, if that makes sense, right? A 2nd round pick this year is our 3rd round pick this year is worth the 2nd round next year, kind of a thing, right?
Yeah.
And if you feed that pipeline, even though yes, there's opportunity costs are being pushed down, if you're doing that regularly every year, you've got that extra 2nd or 3rd round pick, and when you keep that pipeline going. So I wonder if now that they've got the needs the primary needs in place, and they can pick and choose a few spots, if they start building that pipeline of, all right, late 1st round, there's nothing we love here so much that we aren't willing to trade back. Let's trade back, pick up a 2nd round next year or a 3rd rounder next year. And then we end up seeing that they take a couple, defensive players with 2 2nd round picks this year.
No, I agree. We haven't talked about some of it, but you were going to trade back for a Josh Connerly, at least for the most part, and take him late 1st, where he's a guy that would normally go maybe at the top of the 2nd round in that tackle range. You get an extra 3rd rounder for next year, get maybe a 4th rounder this year for moving back a little bit. That's going to be something that you'll be able to make use of. And like you said, we've seen Monty make multiple trade backs before. I think that at some point, because of the contract situation, they'll add a tackle. It just doesn't make sense, I think, to be able to say that tackle will certainly beat out Jonah Williams. It doesn't make sense to also say that tackle should be someone that you're expecting to start at least right away, because you still have a Kelvin Beachum. It's a very important year for Kyler. It's part of why I think if Simmons is going to miss part of the season, why he does make some sense. And out of these guys, him and Banks are probably the only two that would qualify, at least from what I've seen, into potentially the elite category of in college. They played in an elite level. You can project them in a similar level at the NFL. But the position of most needs that we can look at, of course, is going to be at the interior defenders and the edge defenders. Real quick, we've got someone who wanted to talk at least a little bit in terms of AZ Jace. Thanks, AZ Jace, talking about trading up for Membo. That's a possibility if he's someone who maybe falls out of the top 10 and you think we got to have that surefire tackle to start. I think that it would be much less possible with Monty Ossenfort than it might be under a Steve Kine, is part of where I think, because I don't know what the investment of giving up a pick to jump up for a guy is. And with Kelvin Beachum, you got to think they're comfortable enough that they don't need to go up and get that guy when there's maybe a Banks or another guy that you could get either in a trade back or without trading up. But I think that's something that is definitely possible. Drew McWhorter had a great question saying, could we play more 3 wide receiver sets if we had that speeding guy? I think the answer is probably yes, but I think then that would be more of the personnel dictating the offensive staff versus the offensive staff helping to kind of dictate some of the personnel. We saw the Cardinals spend a 3rd round pick on a athletic blocking tight end last year, and I think that every team has to adjust, but the way the league has kind of been right now, we saw the Cardinals have an explosive running game last year as teams built up secondaries, cornerbacks, and light pass rushers to kind of pressure the quarterback, stop the run. Now with the Cardinals, you're talking about if you play a tough running team, you'd want to be able to have another pass catcher out there in addition to Marv and Trey McBride, but trusting some of that to a rookie and being able to at least say that, hey, because teams can stop us in the run, we're going to give up running the ball and just focus on these 3 wide receiver sets. I think you want to keep the vision intact, so I wouldn't completely rule it out, but it is definitely a place where you're probably hoping that, and this is what I would say, is you could also just say, hey, you get that top offensive tackle in, maybe you are the one who then teams aren't able to necessarily stop the run with a 2nd-year leap from Marv and being able to have a little bit more of the use of Kyler Murray getting some time in the pocket. Those are all different possibilities, I think, that are interesting. Any thoughts on that before we check out the defensive linemen?
I really think that their philosophy on offense is something that's very thought out and very intentional and has a lot to do with the kind of quarterback Kyler is. I think they are committing to the run to take a pressure off Kyler to not have to play hero ball, and they're trying to create an offense that is going to pound the ball with the running game, and then you got to worry about Kyler. And then when he needs to, he's got a Marvin Harrison Jr., Trey McBride, and I don't think they're trying to go in any kind of spread or 3 wide receiver sets all the time and just throwing it around the yard. I think they want you to have to defend the run, and then they're going to have 2 tight ends and then take a deep shot when you are expecting the run. And I think they're trying to make Kyler's quarterbacking low volume, high efficiency. And I feel like we're going to see them stay the course in that vision.
Yeah. Cardinals for this year, actually, as far as draft picks go, they've got picks 16, 47, 78, 115, 152, 225. For those who are just hearing those numbers, just know middle of each round, and it's only 1 pick per round, and they're missing a 6th round pick because they traded that pick away last year, I believe, for, I don't remember exactly who it was with the rights for it, but they... I can find it out right now because I'm on the Wikipedia. They got a 7th round pick back for trading away, I believe it was Cameron Thomas, who was the player that they actually traded away to Kansas City. It was the Denver Broncos, and that 6th pick was for Baron Browning, who they did re-sign, and he's going to plug in on the edge rushing spot. So transitioning to edge rushers, at least for the most part, we've got defensive linemen as well. We got Silverwolf AZ says trade down for Nolan. That's what he wants, is to try to move back, get Walter Nolan. The guy that I can say I'm pretty confident won't be here for the Cardinals would be Mason Graham. That one is most likely going to be gone as far as interior defenders. He just has a little bit too much upside as far as when you talk about how he plays and how Kenneth Grant plays and has some huge big splash plays. Like, I don't know if he's as aggressive, whereas Mason Graham, being that shorter arm guy that is just fast, violent, he's the guy that in this draft is maybe not going to be Aaron Donald, but if you're going to be saying we want to get one of those guys who can be that 3 technique that can rush the passer, be able to be aggressive, he's probably going to go somewhere in the top 10. The ones that are interesting is that there's a bit of baggage that pops up with some of these other guys. So the probably best pure edge rusher in this class who doesn't have a medical history is Mike Green. Comes out of Marshall, led the entire NCAA in sacks, and tested into like top 96. So he tested into probably out of the last decade or so of years we've had data, he's somewhere in the top 4 to 5, at least consistently top 10 athletic edge rushers across the board in terms of like his 3-cone, change of pace, direction, strength, whatever you want to call it. He does have a sexual assault charge with how we've talked about with character and other places with Mania. There are some questions we can have about, is that a guy that they would bring in even under a Steve Keim? We saw that a guy in a Robert Kondichi who had some different areas, didn't have anything that checked out as far as with character stuff, as far as it comes to off-field and let's say, missing games necessarily. One of the things that I know from drafting and talking with people who've done stuff within the draft before has been that a lot of teams, if you've got stuff in college, the question is how will that pan out in the NFL? Because when you pay a guy that contract, that rookie contract's guaranteed, even with anything that may happen that's off field. So if there's suspensions or other things that pop up, there's medical that goes into it. And so what we've seen, unfortunately, with the likes of a Deshaun Watson is once his cases were dropped, Cleveland Browns were like, hey, we'll be happy to trade the draft picks and the picks because we know he's not going to really miss future games for some of that off field. Well, it's turned into maybe like the worst trade in, I don't want to say just NFL history, but sports in general, because he hasn't stayed on the field health-wise and has had other issues. So that brings up, there's a risk and a reward to each of those different places. And so Green is an interesting guy that will come up with that. James Pierce Jr. being another interesting risk. He didn't test well at the combine in terms of his explosive traits, but he ran as fast as a Hassan Reddick did for the most part and has similar type of frame and build. Was able to be very disruptive at Tennessee for the most part. That's one of those other players that would be interesting to take a look at for Monty Ossenfort, because it would be against the type that Monty has kind of brought in and drafted, but it would very well fit what we've seen from Jonathan Gannon in that lighter outside type of linebacker who can rush the passer off of the edge. Donovan Ekwizaru is someone who is kind of just consistent, a little bit again on the smaller side, but very quick, smooth. He would be kind of that player who, if he went at the 16th pick, that I would just be like, yeah, he checks the boxes and all that you're wanting. Maybe doesn't have that guy who will be that top elite, top pass rusher, but he might be that guy that ends up being the player that we had hoped that before some of the injuries, and maybe still could be, that BJ Ojolari could have been. Any thoughts, at least before we get into, these are all guys who are on the edge, who could go before the Cardinals pick, depending on how things stack out, or could be someone that they may end up going for, at least potentially with that 16th pick, especially at the edge rushing spot.
Yeah, after they signed Josh Sweat, I look at this edge rushing group, right? And obviously you've got, Zaven out there in the edge role that they use him in, which is kind of a weird hybrid. Not your conventional pin your ears back and go up to the quarterback kind of edge.
Yeah.
But
Sam, very much a strong side Sam linebacker, at least, where he can guard tight ends in coverage, but he'll be the one shedding blocks in the run game and occasionally rushing at the passer to get a sack off of the edge every once in a while, depending on if the coverage is good.
And then you have guys like BJ Ojolari and Xavier, is it Thomas? I think they drafted last year.
Xavier Thomas.
A lot of kind of guys they're trying to develop. And then they have Josh Sweat, who is going to start, right? So him and Xavier are going to be the starters. So I feel like when we look at what they're going to do with edge rushers, I feel like they're going to lean towards high upside guys, athletic freaks, right? Guys with just really high end traits, maybe who don't have as much experience starting, but have a lot of upside, have just scratched the surface. I look like a guy like Braden Swinson out of LSU. PFF's profile says he didn't become a full-time starter until his final season, has very active hands, good understanding of rushing the passer, so on and so forth. Guys, so I think we're not going to, I think it's less likely we'll see a high floor guy that they take, because I think BJ Ojolari is kind of that guy, right? Like he's showed enough and had enough production in college that he's a guy that, as long as he's healthy, is going to, at worst, be a nice solid rotation guy, right? But he may or may not have the upside we hope. And since they don't need this edge rusher to start, and hold down the fort right away, I think they're going to lean towards someone who has traits where there's at least a better chance that if they hit on him, he could become that elite edge rusher. So I feel like those higher risk reward, not necessarily the off the field stuff, but in terms of the traits and the high upside is where I feel like it makes more sense to go in that direction, because that guy's going to need to kind of sit and develop anyway.
Yeah, and some of what we can at least look at as far as for preferences, like you said, is going to be more built around size, speed, and strength combinations. A good example for seeing how this goes, and this is a good resource at least. It's called Relative Athletic Score, which is done by Kent Lee Platt or MathBomb. Just taking a look at who the Cardinals signed this year in Josh Sweat. So you're talking about a guy who, out of 980 defensive ends, he like scored in the green elite range for pretty much everything. And then he weighed in at 251 pounds. He plays a little bit higher than that. He actually was just making sure he could run a 4.5 40. That's where, when you talk about like what is a Jonathan Gannon type of defensive end, that would be the answer there, is someone who's got size, who's got some of that athleticism. We saw that with Darius Robinson being a guy at least who had some of that size. And when you start looking at tendencies for players, that's where those things can actually stand out. Like if you look at Robinson and his RAS score from just last year that Monty drafted as a defensive tackle, very similar. So you're talking about large athlete, is nice, and for his relative to the rest of the position is pretty quick, pretty explosive. We've seen that with Josh Sweat. Brings up some interesting guys for this year, because you can take a look at a former, I think want to say Arizona Cardinal in Hassan Reddick, who was drafted by the Cardinals, and he ended up testing out as very athletic as that defensive end. He just was small. And what we've seen is his move was to linebacker, but he was so small that at 6'1", 237, some people thought he had to play at inside linebacker, be that Darrell Washington replacement. What we've seen is that with the players who are edge rushers that are not as athletic, who are maybe super productive in college, maybe your big names, the one that comes to mind, at least out of this here, would probably be the, I want to say Ohio State pass rusher. Jack Sawyer is one of those, for example. So Jack Sawyer, really productive, made some great plays. He's probably one of those guys that, because of the athleticism, is not someone that the Cardinals would end up taking that early, because he just didn't test into being that top level of athlete. Sawyer ended up with, I want to pull that up here real quick for those of you who are looking at it. Yeah, this Max Crosby thing is just not really quite there, but you're talking about just for the sacks, the disruption, some of the other places, he just didn't test in athletically to have the same size or the same explosiveness, and so he could be a great player, but you're talking about a Marcus Golden upside. I think I agree with you that Monty seems to prefer the Hassan Reddick, Chandler Jones sort of double-digit plus sacks each year types of players. And that's what I think that we would be more likely to see from one of these edge rushers. So that will for sure put a Donovan Equizarus in an interesting spot, because he doesn't have the biggest height, not the biggest weight, but he is pretty fine. He didn't run to be able to see some of that explosiveness. And another player that has been mocked to the Cardinals, they've seen quite a bit, in James Pierce Jr. I don't know if he's going to test into that sort of category for Arizona, because he kind of tested out with his weight at 245, not like a biggest size speed freak. And his vertical being short, he had a good broad jump, but really he ran a 4.5 40, that speed, and you can see that speed off the edge in tape. But explosiveness, the thing that we're wondering is if he just doesn't have the height, weight, and explosiveness that Monty and Gannon are looking for. It wouldn't shock me if he's not a guy that the Cardinals would target at 16, maybe in a trade back sort of scenario, which kind of leaves you with edge rushers. I want to say, I've got my draft board here, not really fitting for the guys who may be there for the Arizona Cardinals outside of Mike Green, for who kind of check all those boxes, for example, of size, weight, speed that you'd be looking for, especially with a Michael Williams being a guy who really did not have a good pass rushing production level, and a Shamar Stewart having that type of ability. But we've seen with Monty, he likes a Darius Robinson guy who gets sacks in college. Neither of these guys were able to get to double-digit sacks. Shamar Stewart never got to more than two sacks a season. I don't know if these are guys the Cardinals would take at 16, and that makes me think they could be at a position other than edge rusher.
And there's an interesting kind of departure between Monty and I think Jonathan Gannon, at least when you look at history, when it comes to type of edge rusher, because the Patriots always liked those bigger edge rushers that were more run stoppers and versatile, and they'd get a few sacks, but they moved it with their multiple fronts. Their edge rushers tended to be bigger so they could be better against the run and do a lot of things. But with the Eagles, you see a lot of smaller edge rushers on their roster, right? And guys going back to Hassan Reddick, I'm looking at the screen. I don't know if you want to share or not, but like the edge rushers that for the Eagles right now, and the guy they drafted in the first round, Nolan Smith, 6'2", 238, right? And they signed Azeez Ojulari, 6'3", 240.
Mm-hmm.
They have a guy from a 7th round pick, Patrick Johnson, 6'2", 248. Jalix Hunt, a 3rd rounder, he's 6'4", 248. They signed Joshua Uche, 6'3", 240, right? Bryce Huff, 6'3", 255. KJ Henry, 6'4", 255. Then the biggest guy is a guy named Mathis, who's 6'5", 260, was 6th rounder. But a lot of they like a lot of those smaller guys more so than we saw with the Patriots. So what is the side? Well, they drafted Darius, but they moved him more inside. Okay, so maybe that's kind of that versatile guy. They drafted BJ Ojulari, who's a little bit of a smaller side on the edge rusher. So it's kind of tough to figure out which direction will they go. I think we're more likely to see them go more towards the Gannon direction because that's who has to coach, and that's the scheme that that they're drafting for. So that seems like where we might see more is towards the smaller ones. To your point, you even look at Xavier Thomas, the guy they drafted. He's a little stouter, but he's 6'2", 255, right? So not those the big guys. They play him inside. They draft guys like Darius Williams to move them more inside rather than keep them on the edge like the Patriots might have.
Yeah.
So yeah.
No, I think those are all really good points. It's going to be really interesting to see. The other 2 players we haven't quite talked about before we get into our mock draft scenarios are Jalen Walker and Mykel Williams of the, I believe it's the Georgia Bulldogs. Walker is interesting because he is essentially a true tweener. Like, if people thought Hassan Reddick was a tweener, I went and looked back, and my take on him coming out was when he played defensive end, they're moving him to linebacker. Like, he was elite at getting tackles behind the line of scrimmage from the defense line as an undersized player. Jalen Walker doesn't have a lot of experience in coverage, doesn't have a lot of experience as far as being a pass rusher. He is just freakish athlete for the most part, and is quite a good size, long arms. It's kind of one of those places where you wonder how much of this is like, hey, give him to Nick Rawlis, let him develop him into a freak, and how much of it is we've seen the Cardinals take guys who were in those type of freak positions like an Isaiah Simmons and move them into a set position. I don't see Walker as being one of the guys who would fit into that place, and then a Mykel Williams being the other player. Overall, like, great player for the most part when you're talking about as being a run defender. He's very explosive, but he just ends up being in a spot where he doesn't seem to have that elite kind of quickness for the most part. There's still some development to go, and he didn't have that same production as a result. Like someone said, if this draft he was in as a prospect in there like 2 years ago, like Will Anderson had gotten all the hype a couple of years ago, and he paid off that and became a top 3 pick. People expected that from Mykel Williams, and it didn't quite pan out. So even though he's an explosive guy for the most part, he just doesn't have the quite edge rush that you're looking for. So you're banking on upside similar to a Shamar Stewart. So I don't see that being the case for him as being a guy the Cardinals would get at least at 16. And if they trade back, it's hard to be able to justify that. So let's do the last spot, which, of course, we're going to talk about the interior defenders. There's 2 of those guys. I know we talked about Kenneth Grant being the one already. We actually have one of the suggestions here in trading back for Nolan, which has basically been said here from Silverwolf. We'll see what goes on with him as far as he doesn't have as much polish, but between him and Derek Harmon, 2 of the most mocked players to the Arizona Cardinals. We'll kind of rush through some of this, whereas Harmon, the experience is kind of a question, but he kind of fits the if you're talking about what they already got in Darius Robinson last year, bringing another player in who could be similar from that 3-tech spot, you could put Harmon on the line, move Darius Robinson out to like the edge or defensive end spot, be able to then have enough at least of a push up front that could rotate through, get him that year one experience. Nolan at least has more physical gifts for the most part. I think that the questions, I know there's some questions about character that hasn't quite been revealed. Kenneth Grant is another one as far as a unique nose tackle tackle. He would be the closest thing to a Vita Vea type in this draft, where he's maybe not going to be always attacking or aggressive. Like sometimes you're like, oh, like he makes so many great splash plays, just wish it was every single down. I would at least trust this Cardinals defensive line group and their coaching staff to at least get the most out of him. But I think there's enough teams in the league that would think the same thing, that I could see him going right where Vita Vea went, 13th, 14th, somewhere ahead of where Arizona picks. There's also the potential for some other guys in the second round, like a Tyleek Williams, Omar Norman Lott, and then the other one I know that some Cardinals fans have liked is Alfred Collins from the age. He's a little older, but he can play anywhere on the line and could end up blossoming into a starter that you could just instantly get in the second round, could end up being a long-term rotational guy for you if you are taking an offensive lineman in the first. So with all that to be said, now is finally the time. Let's put some of what we've talked about to action. So I think that we're in agreement. The Cardinals are probably not going to trade up. If anything, they would trade back. So I think we're probably good to just start the draft, and then we'll probably do one mock. At least we'll see if what we'll go through with the Cardinals for all 7 picks. Are you ready, sir?
I am. Let's do this.
All right, let's go ahead and start that draft. So what we've got for some quick analysis here, as we're seeing at the top of the draft, you got your quarterbacks do go 1 and 2 in this scenario. Shedeur Sanders going ahead helps the Cardinals. You're also able to see some of the elite prospects such as Campbell, Carter, Hunter, Janty all gone, Armand Membo gone. We'll see on Jihad Campbell. Like you and I talked already about linebacker. Cardinals have not invested highly into one of those. You've got a tight end off of the board. You also have 3 edge rushers off of the board right before Arizona picks. So you've got Tet McMillan, who's still sitting here on the draft board. You've got Mike Green, the edge rusher, who's here. I know some people have looked at Will Johnson. He's been primarily more of the kind of zone coverage guy versus like a one-on-one guy. We've already talked about how we don't see corner necessarily being the best pick for there. It looks like that from our standpoint, you've got guys like a Simmons, a Kenneth Grant is here, Pierce Jr. is here, Calvin Banks is here, as well as Nolan. What would you be leaning toward in this scenario, and would you try to trade back if you could potentially with how the board's fallen?
You know, there are some players you didn't expect to be there. I mean, Will Johnson, still sitting there maybe is a bit of a surprise. Obviously, McMillan is a huge surprise. But that surprise, there's 2 ways you can look at it, right? It's like, wow, this is a player maybe we should take because we didn't expect him to be there, or someone else really wants that player because they didn't expect him to be there, and because he's there still, you might even get a little bit more in trade than you would have otherwise, right? Get a bidding war for that player. And I'm probably trying to trade back to see if I can capitalize on the bidding war for someone who likes Johnson or McMillan or someone else that they didn't expect to be there. So that's where I'm going if it's me in that situation. What are you doing?
Yeah, I think in this spot with how it fell, I would also look at trading back because there's plenty of tackles who are here. There's plenty of defensive linemen. I see the Bengals are picking up next with having, I believe, both Kenneth Grant and having like a Walter Nolan at least on the board, along with Derek Harmon. I know that Joe Goodberry, who is Bengals beat writer, he says that he believes that Derek Harmon is the pick at 17 if he's there for the Bengals. So in this scenario, maybe someone wants to trade ahead of the Bengals to snipe it for them. I think that if the Cardinals don't take him here, I think that Harmon would go with the next pick. This is one of those cases where I would agree with you. I think there would be a team looking to trade back up for Tet McMillan if he's fallen this far. The team that makes the most sense here, and this is maybe kind of in hindsight, maybe the Bengals should have let T. Higgins walk, not paid him, and then rolled the dice on Tet McMillan just to be able to field more of a defense. But in this spot, we'll take a look at some of the different options. The Seahawks at least are looking to trade the Broncos, Eagles, Jaguars, Patriots, and Falcons. Now in this draft, the 5th pick was Travis Hunter, so I don't know if the Jaguars would trade up for a receiver to be able to pair with. The team that makes the most sense for one of those would be a team like the Denver Broncos. I think that you could also look at, in my opinion, the one that I'm surprised is not on here, the Los Angeles Chargers getting Tet McMillan as an actual receiver for Justin Herbert. That would be the one that I think you would probably look at as being one that you could look at offering the most likely to. Obviously, at least when it comes to being able to make one of those different deals or trades, it's not something that we'll have on the board, but I think in this spot, if we're able to make a trade with a team, that would be what I would look at. And the Broncos are a team that probably makes the most sense. I don't think I'll try it for the Chargers here. Let's see 22 and 16, and then knowing what we know, you have a chance to get Ted McMillan. You're probably going to swap some picks, so I would say the Cardinals could get 86 and then give back. Say pick 100 and I think 152, and probably, do you don't think a round 4 pick next year potentially?
Yes, maybe. I wonder if they have to give that up or not, right? It's because
Yeah,
we're
maybe
looking at a
115,
situation-
maybe 115 may be good enough there, at least if you're wanting to do that.
Keep in mind, we're looking at this as a scenario where players that you didn't expect to still be there are there,
Yeah.
right? So you might be able to twist their arm a little bit, right?
Right.
So let's say 150, throw 152 at them, right? Just to give it something realistic.
They've got extra picks because of the 7 compensational picks, so 152 actually will fit because then they can use 152, 158, move up if they want to or have some flexibility.
Right.
We'll go ahead and say that trade will at least go ahead and force that through. So now we've got the Chargers on the clock, and Cardinals go back through. So now we've got a few more players off of the board. I'll scroll back up so we can see who went. Okay, this great one on receivers, edge rushers as well, with Mike Green going. Ted McMillan finally goes. I don't know why he goes to the Steelers in this scenario. You think that maybe they've got enough receivers by now, but the draft and how we'll see a lot of times the players will be gone. It just depends because of teams moving around and how it goes. Which team gets which player ends up being the case. So here we have the board fall in a great spot for the Cardinals. They got a 3rd round pick. They have the opportunity to draft a safety of the future who I don't think they'll take. You've got Josh Simmons on the board, Calvin Banks on the board, Walter Nolan is still on the board, and you could even take Derek Harmon. In this spot, normally I'd say, hey, maybe you look at could you trade back again, but at some point you're going to have to accept that teams are just not going to want to move up for a certain player. There's obviously more guys there. I've usually felt like there's a range that Monty will trade back to versus keep trading back, and as we saw in his first draft with the Cardinals, he traded back to pick 12, but didn't want to leave the top 6 picks overall. Who would you say you'd take for the Cardinals in this scenario?
This is tough. I mean, Josh Simmons is really intriguing to me, but so is Walter Nolan. But I feel like based on the scarcity versus abundance, I think we're going to end up taking a defensive tackle in the next couple picks, especially that we added a 3rd round pick. We've got more to work with. And, I think in this situation, if we're staying again, I'm probably more looking at whichever tackle they like between those two. And so if you want to pick between the two, Josh and Kelvin, but I think that's the position if we're in this scenario.
Yeah, I think if the Cardinals take Kelvin Banks Jr. and Josh Simmons is on the board, you'll know that his actual offensive line coach did not sign off on the injuries for each of those. I think in this scenario, I would probably take Simmons because I think that he has a bit more smoothness and upside. It's a difficult injury, but he's younger, and like we said, the setup is almost perfect. You have a combination of Jonah Williams and Kelvin Beachum for a year. Simmons maybe comes in for some snaps, gets some use as the swing tackle at the end of the year. He could then come in without any other guys under contract. You got Christian Walker now is the new Kelvin Beachum for you. I think we'll take Simmons in this scenario. Now, as we see, we're going to pause the draft here as we see a couple other players fly off the board. Do you think the Cardinals would move up from the pick 47 in this draft for any players? We have the extra draft capital from the Chargers. I don't think that Monty would move up a second time versus seeing how the board would probably fall as it were. Do you think that there'd be potentially a small move that they could make, or is this just going to kind of see how the board plays out for 47?
I think moving up a little bit is absolutely a possibility if there's a player they really like there. They're not going to have to give up nearly as much, at this point to move up. And if we're just talking a few picks. So where did we pause at this point?
Well, we paused a little bit early, at least, just to make sure we didn't skip it. But we've got guys available for pick 47's the Cardinals. You've got players up as far as the Falcons, who they've traded with before. We've seen the New Orleans Saints at pick 40, so that's going to be probably a little bit after the first 4 or 5 picks. You could trade pretty far up into a first-round talent who falls, but I think when you're talking about the Browns with their needs at quarterback, the Giants with needs at quarterback, the Titans having to probably go with the quarterback and then get an edge rusher, and with how the Jaguars took Travis Hunter, you're probably going to have another need somewhere, either on the defense or the offense, depending on how they have him. So thing that I would say that would be if you're going to trade up, I would pick the New England Patriots as a possible team. They need more talent. They're probably going to get a top 5 player or a top 4 player who falls to them. Maybe they want to stockpile more picks with Elliott Wolf. That would be my target. And Monty's going to have plenty of connections with each of those there. I think that's more likely than his Titans connections. Do you think that you'd want to move up? Because in this case, you're probably going to have to give up pick 86 if you're going to make a move up to pick 38, just because of how it still is pretty high in capital. I would almost rather keep that other 3rd round pick for now and then see exactly what would play out as far as later in the draft, for knowing that there's some talent that falls. But would you move up?
I would not. I think there's so many defensive tackles you like there that I'd rather sit and even consider trading back if there's 3 guys I like, do get some more draft capital. So I think I could see them trade up if their tiers, right? If like the last guy in their 2nd tier or 3rd tier defensive tackles or whatever is sitting there, right?
Yeah.
So it's hard to figure out where they draw those lines. So I think I could see a move up, but I think it'd be more just a 3 or 4 picks to get that guy. But if it's me, I'm sitting and seeing who the best defensive tackle is there or edge rusher. And if when we get to pick 47, I see multiple guys I like, I maybe even trading back again.
Yeah, so the I think it's Spielberger, which is essentially like the old Jimmy Johnson draft chart, would have a cost of moving up to pick 38 would be worth about 1157, and then move up from the Cardinals, it would be about 1049. So you're talking about worth probably about what would that be? About 100 or so worth, which would put it to essentially, as far as this year, you're having to overpay no matter what you're doing to kind of move up that far. So 115 should work, but if you're talking about pick 38 from 47, as we've seen a lot of times to move up, sometimes it can cost a bit of a premium where it'll cost you a 3rd round pick. I could see the Patriots saying, we'll do it for pick 100 or pick 90, but not pick 115. I don't think you want to throw in more than that. So I'm just going to go ahead and resume that draft, knowing that the trade will not be accepted. And we've got our 2nd rounder on the board. So Jaden Higgins falls off of the board. That's one of those receivers I know some people have mocked to Arizona in round 2. You got some of your first running backs, another tackle. Tyleik Williams, a guy I would have probably liked to have seen, goes off the board here. You now have 2 players that stand out that I think are really interesting. You've got edge rusher JT Tuamalo from Ohio State, not as athletic, but was productive and has a lot of that size speed combination that you're looking for, and is an Ohio State person. So like, he's got power, he's got some of the ability to be able to actually get like some cleanup sacks overall. He's one of those players who, if you're going to talk about an Ohio State guy who turns into like your next Marcus Golden, he's also played at number 44, so that's another thing. Take that for what it's worth. He's one of the guys that pops up there. Brandon Swinson at LSU is another one that at least probably a little bit more upside for the most part. He at least has better pass rush potential for the most part, at least like that one. Like, he's able to get good effective rushing. It's just in the run defense has been kind of one of the questions where having his experiences there. You got a couple of cornerbacks here. I think we've talked about corners don't seem likely to fall, and there's a halfback at least there as well that's going this high in the draft. Probably won't go as high, although he did run in the 4.5s, but compared to where some other players are there, not as likely. And then Carson Schlesinger is my favorite round 2 linebacker. We just have not seen the Cardinals invest in day 2, so we're not going to invest in it here. We got to go with, obviously, Scatterby, right? Or is there any other player that you think fits for the Cardinals on this board?
So, for me, if I'm sitting there, I'm doing one of 2 things. If there's one of those 3 edge rushers that I like better than the others, I'm taking him. If they're all the same to me, I'm trying to trade back a few spots and still get one of those 3.
Yeah, one of the players you'd be trading back in as far as interest, you'd be trading back into the 60s or the 70s. You'd have to then be trying to find a trade partner in between. I think that we can kind of stay put. I think the big question is between Princely, who's someone who I think is a good edge rusher. He's got some of the twitchiness, being able to have some of the length, kind of some of that upside that we talk about. The biggest difference that we've seen with him is what we've seen the Cardinals like has been size, speed, length, and just kind of having some of that power. This is a guy who, while he's an undersized type of 3-4 linebacker, he kind of doesn't have some of the things that you would look for, like the Hassan Reddick type or some of that high definition bend off the edge. And we've seen the Cardinals have kind of two different preferences. One is maybe not as twitchy, but having that strength and that power. And we've seen having some of that speed, length, and athletic upside, and having some production. I don't know if he has quite as much production. We don't see as much of the speed to power that Reddick has had or that Josh Sweat has had. I don't think that he's as consistent. So it's going to be some upside for the most part if he's in the correct role. But in here, I think if you're talking about getting in someone who you know can at least be one of those edge rushers right away, they have a similar type already with JT Tuimoloau on the roster. It's just the question is, do you go with the speedy, more upside edge rusher? Do you go with the other player here? I think that in this spot, I would go with Tuimoloau because we've seen already the Ohio State pedigree that they have. I don't think you're taking a cornerback. I don't think you're taking a linebacker. And for certain, you're probably not going to take another tackle. So let's go with JT Tuimoloau here. And the Cardinals are now going to be having a couple of draft picks here. This is where I think it gets kind of interesting around pick 60. As we can see here with the Cardinals, they have a couple of linebackers off the board. They have a couple of tackles off the board. We're probably going to be waiting at least all the way down for pick 78. So let's resume the draft here. We've got about 7 teams left. All right, so there we've got a defensive lineman off the board. We have another quarterback off the board. We also have, unless I am mistaken, Jack Sawyer has gone off the board. Cam Scadaboo went to the Broncos at pick 51. I wouldn't be shocked if he ends up as a Steeler or a Raven, now that the Vikings have made a trade for a running back. What do you think that we'd be looking for in the Cardinals position? Because I think we're probably going to be content to make 2 picks back-to-back and resume from our draft here. So now you've got Marcus Mbo as the tackle. You've got a defensive lineman here in Josh Farmer. You do have Chris Paul Jr. as your linebacker, who's actually got like some pretty size and good fluidity. He's just a little bit undersized. It does feel like that if the Cardinals are going to be looking for that upside linebacker, it's probably going to be on day 3. So I think this is a spot where you're probably going to be looking at, if not an interior guy, the one that I really think stands out in this spot is probably going to be a Florida guy and Josh Farmer or Jordan Phillips from Maryland, with a potential speedy receiver that you could look for if he falls. I think I'll try to aim for that at pick 86 and focus on the trenches with this pick. Any of these guys stand out to you?
Yeah, and I the guys you just identified, because at this point we passed on defensive interior line early, right, to trade back and go with a couple other positions. To me, if you're doing that, you have to get yourself a defensive lineman in this range, right? And Joshua Farmer has kind of the upside, in terms of potential. With defensive interior linemen, the guys that go in the top half of the first round are guys that can rush the passer, right? That have that ability in addition to doing all the other disruptive stuff against the run game. When you get to this range, you find a lot of guys that are good against the run, but not good pass rushers. And occasionally someone who can rush the passer and is really bad against the run.
That would be Jordan Phillips, at least with the analysis. Like, he's small, compact, has a lot of strength, but like interior guy for the most part. So it's like, if you wanted to say like, hey, this could be a second Dante Stills type, that would be probably something you could find. Of course, with how we've seen in the past, would you take the more like rounded upside guy or the maybe smaller, more undersized guy if you had to pick between the two?
So I think, because I think I'm going with the guy with a little more upsides, Joshua Farmer. I feel like in terms of pass rush upside, because they brought in Tomlinson, right? Yeah. He's to really kind of stabilize that. And as much as I know Cardinals fans are really burnt by these guys, the 2 free agents they signed last year, Jones and Nichols, right? Yeah. Yes, they played bad. They were not playing well before they got injured, and then they got injured, but they have played reasonably well in this league before. You could argue that they were playing poorly in part because maybe the injuries were already kind of starting and or adjusting to the system. But I think it's another one of those positions where they don't have Tomlinson is a really great player. But they have some guys that they can start. And I feel like you don't need another guy like Dante Stills to come in and start as a rookie or play snaps as a rookie because you have no one else there. I think what you want is a guy who you can develop with upside, much like with edge, as we talked about, because you brought in Tomlinson and because Darius Robinson's going to be on the interior and because the Nichols and Jones are coming back, and at least one of them will probably play a role there. And because they brought back Collier and because you have Stills, give me the guy who in 2 years could surprise people as or develop into a guy with some pass rush.
I think that's definitely fair. I think I would probably go with Farmer in this spot. The other name that's interesting here is a Jalen Noel, because that is going to be the slot receiver who essentially is not as dynamic after the catch, but is very explosive and quick and precise, kind of like is able to be a decent slot who has some deep threat for the most part. Now, he doesn't line up as much outside of the numbers, and I think what we've seen with the Cardinals, this is kind of the one downside, is he's tall enough at 5'11". It's not like you're talking about a 5'7" Dortch, but it is one of those places, at least, where he doesn't quite fit, I think, the perfect Cardinals type, which I think would be an Alec Pierce, who is the deep threat, 6'2" and heavy type of playmaker that the Colts have. He's probably one of the closer things you can get to it, but I agree with you in this spot that I would rather go with Farmer and then risk it to see if I can maybe get someone like him a little bit later. And there we see Jalen Noel is later. You also have a Jonah Savaiana, which is really interesting because he could be one of those guys who's an inside move to guard type of player that you're looking at. The Cardinals have already drafted a tackle. They've got needs on defense. He's a bit heavier than some guys at 336 for the most part with good feet. What I would say in this spot, at least, is you're probably going to be wanting to look at maybe a full-time guard like a Tate Ratledge if you're going to. I don't know if we're going to be able to trade back from another spot here. This is kind of an interesting place for the draft where talent-wise, I would just take Marcus Embo just to be able to have that guy and put him inside a guard for like the next decade or so. But he may be too good as far as with being a tackle because he's a little bit shorter and he's at least good enough with how he moves for the most part. He may have to be one of those outside tackle first and then a little bit lighter. Maybe you end up moving him inside to guard. It'll be interesting to see where that goes, but what do you have as far as for in this range? Is there a favorite that you're liking?
You know, if we hadn't taken a tackle earlier, I'd go back to the guy I mentioned before, Wyatt Millam, but we did take a tackle. And I would love to, Chris Paul's sitting there, and I'd love to see them get a linebacker. They have taken, you know, the almighty chart does show third round linebacker. They have taken them before. Maybe they go a little premium there and get the guy who can be an upgrade there. So with what I see on the board, based on what we've already taken, I'm probably actually intrigued by Jalen Noel or Chris Paul Jr. This is where maybe I kind of go in a little bit different direction. I think they like interior offensive line. They have taken him in the third round, like guys like Isaiah Adams and a guy they took, I think it was Shaq Mason, who was really good for them at the Patriots. So if they're taking in the third round interior offensive line, I think it's a guy they really like. They're much more likely to take them in the fourth round. So for me, I'm looking at, Chris Paul Jr. is actually a guy that's really intriguing me, although I'm not sure that's what they do.
I don't know if that's what the case is either. Like, if you wanted to say what would happen with like a Mason Taylor, it'd be like it's a tight end 2 or 3 for the most part, at least, where he would be like the upgrade to your tight end 3 for as a rookie, and then eventually is able to like be able to play inline as well as the slot. He'd be either basically the third tight end as your rookie. You're pushing Elijah Higgins in that. We've seen them take tight ends pretty high before. They seem to value that. But I agree with you in that. I'm taking Chris Paul Jr. because I think you get that athleticism that you're looking for at a linebacker spot. And there's going to be snaps, I think, available for him as a rookie to rotate in later in the year, just because of how they don't have the same depth at that position with Kaiser White moving on. So we will go ahead and select him, and that's going to then launch us down into quite a few picks before. We just went from 83 to 150. Some of the highlights of players that went, we saw Harold Fanning Jr. at tight end, the 4-3 speedster Isaiah Bond went. We got to see Wyatt Millam, another favorite, as well as Jonah Savaiana. It sounds like the Savaiana from The Lion King, so apologies if I butcher this. Round 4. This one, at least, I think when I'm taking a look at the film, there's one player that stands out to me over here. It's not a quarterback. It is Kobe Bryant, who is a pretty much like very aggressive, very physical type of player. Was able to get his hand on quite a few balls for the most part like that one. He also is a guy who tackles very well with long arms. So like he fits pretty much the Jonathan Gannon archetype of corner. And while it may seem like you'd want to get someone in the front 7 or be able to even look at, say, another wide receiver here, really there's not a receiver that I think really flashes at this point. I would take a look, honestly, at least at maybe even like at one of the halfbacks ahead of one of the guys like a Torrey Horton here. That would be the one that I would probably take. Is there someone who stands out that you would look at?
Yeah, so I'm thinking at least starting more in terms of position, looking at the almighty chart, right? And um this is fourth round is where they love taking guards and centers.
Hmm.
The Patriots drafted a certain guy named Yelta Froholt there, right? Right in the fourth round, right? And so that's where they like to get those interior offensive linemen. So this is the point where I start looking at who is the athletic interior offensive lineman that we maybe weren't thinking about, right? And
Yeah.
you look at John Gaines, right? He was super athletic. He was a guy who wasn't really on our radar, but he was the guy they took in that fourth round. So if there is this interior offensive lineman you can find that is very athletic that you like, that's who I'm looking at. Other positions I'd also look at, I mentioned safety before. This is a range where they sometimes will take safety. So if there's a guy you like there at safety, maybe you want to get that guy to develop for the reasons we talked about earlier. This is also a place where they've taken a number of receivers. So if you find a slot or a speed guy you like, I know you mentioned that earlier, but I'm looking first and foremost at interior offensive line. That is one of the strongest trends in the almighty chart that I've seen. And you mentioned cornerback, but that would be the first cornerback on the chart. Now, as we said, that doesn't mean he won't do it. But if they don't get him on day two, they seem to much rather wait to the 6th and 7th round to get those guys who, as you mentioned, are going to be special teams contributors as well.
Right. The one I'm looking at here would be there's not that many linemen who did the I would say the 3-cone, but as far as how these guys tested out, Tate Ratledge is the one that has the athleticism, but he's already off of the board by this point, I believe. So what you're probably looking at then is going to be more of a Colby Connor. Seth McLaughlin isn't a guy who's as athletic, and he fills more of that center hole. With how the Cardinals have seemingly addressed like starter spots, they like to kind of find a veteran, stick him in there. Maybe if you're going to talk about like at the end of his deal next year when it's up, maybe a replacement could go in, but they've already got guys like you said in John Gaines and others who are there. The one that at least sticks out to me if I was going to go for that would be a Connor Colby, even more than a Tyler Cooper, because Tyler Cooper, at least from what I know as far as the guard spot, is he's going to be mostly like outside zone type of a player. He's at least got some good stuff in the run game. But he's not the most athletic guy, and that's something that we have seen is that they will go with the more athletic player when they're taking guys in that route. I would honestly just take a look at this and say I'm going to probably say that maybe they go with round 5 for one of these guys and see who kind of falls, and then round 4 you could probably get a guy who what we saw last year, it depends on, are you going to count on an Elijah Jones? Do you take a safety like a Jonas Senker to kind of be that long-term safety? It looks like they don't have a scouting summary up for him at PFF, because at this spot, for the most part, like that one, you could probably double dip at an offensive lineman or another spot, or even, take another position if you wanted to.
Jace makes a good point, though. Look at offensive tackles, because some of those guys might get kicked in there, right?
Yep.
So there might be an offensive tackle at that range who is, more of like what they did with Isaiah Adams. Is there an offensive tackle you see around there that
I don't know if Jalen Rivers, I think he's just a tackle. At least he's got versatility for guard and tackle, which is there, but the athleticism's a bit low. And that was something I remembered was when we're talking about who like some of those cheat code guys are, that's not one that's going to pop up, at least for the most part, is far as that goes. So that's part of why I'm taking a look. And you always need a corner. You get a guy who's maybe more of a ball hawk, could kind of get you an upgrade, would be probably who I'd go with Bryant ahead of Dotson. I just don't seemingly like some of the other players who are there. JJ Pegas, as far as for with his quickness, is pretty good, like winning on the interior and edge. But when it comes to what we've done, we could draft back-to-back, I think, defensive linemen if we wanted to. If we would have been drafted, I think it was, who did we get? Oh, we got our linebacker, we've got our defensive lineman, we've got our offensive lineman, and we've also got our edge rusher. I wouldn't mind taking Pegs over there. I just think that from what I know about Bryant, what I've seen like that one, I just know that that's a dog that I would love to be able to get. That could be like your long-term cornerback. That could be able to end up replacing potentially on the opposite side of Max Melton. Could replace a Starling Thomas, or at least compete with him, and would certainly be able to upgrade over a Sean Murphy Bunting.
So yeah, I have a hard time seeing cornerback there, but obviously this is a 2-man exercise. So if you want to go that, I'm not gonna
You want to take a running back there, at least for the most part, with one of the best athletes in the draft. I would probably lean against that. I think this could be honestly the Cam Scatabo range. Honestly, is where I think he's more likely to go, running in the 4.5s, just because there's so many freak athletes that are there. I'll go ahead and take Kobe Bryant here, and then we'll get past to round 5. Only 2 picks left. This is going to be your special teamers type of range, and then probably at this spot, this is I think exactly where we're looking for that athletic offensive lineman if we can find one. Actually, we're going to go all the way down past round 5, I believe, all the way to round 7 because we traded up with that round 5 pick and didn't trade back. So now we're all the way down here at pick 225. At this point, it's kind of just going to be being able to find who you think the best value is. Is there one that stands out to you?
I have a couple names for you.
Aha.
Because they like linebackers late. Now, they would have preferred to get them in the 6th round, right? Mm-hmm. But they do take linebacker. They have the Almighty chart does have one linebacker in the 7th round, so it is not heresy. Mm-hmm. But these are guys that are athletic is really the main thing. Guys, the 2 linebackers with the 2 best 40 times at the combine. Kane Medrano from UCLA and Eugene Asante from Auburn. Asante is probably the better prospect between those two. Those are late flyers who are going to be special team contributors who athletically are pretty good, may have some questions in terms of some of the football-y kinds of things in terms of developing in some areas. But when we look at that, they like to take linebackers late, and they like, Owen Pappo was an athletic freak, right? And that's one of the things they looked at. So that's something I would look at. But I would also say look at receiver. If we, if we didn't get one we liked, let's see if this is where we see what's left. If there's someone that they like there in terms of a slot guy, perhaps.
Yeah, I think so too. The one that is really going to be interesting to me, I think, for all of those that what I liked, but I don't see him in this lane, would have been a Torrey Holton, who ran in the 4.4, was someone who at least had some deep separating ability. As far as the fastest, like 4.2, 4.3 guys, most all of those are off the board as of now for the receiving spot. So what I'd probably say, at least, is I agree with you in that this could be weird to see a linebacker like potentially pop up. I think this could also be the place where you could end up seeing another edge rusher that's very late. Could be something that would pop up. The one that at least I would also not rule out would be if you think you can get a tight end 3 that would hop up a little bit. That's another possibility for each of those. The one that really seems like that's not going to get drafted, I can say, is probably Kyron Lacy. Even though he did an okay recovery, it just doesn't seem like he's a receiver that's going to get drafted. The one that I would probably go after here that I like from is the Illinois defense had, I think it was, Jalen Walker, at least as far as for how it went. He ends up measuring at 6'1", 218, very, very small. So you're talking about like basically special teams type of player for the most part. I don't think Theo Wise worked out at all at the combine, or at least didn't run the 40. He wasn't invited either. So that's one of those things to be able to look out for. So what I am going to kind of do here is I'm going to remove this and take a look at each of those. And we're in pick 7 for the most part. You've got a safety sitting there in Keaton Crawford, who I think at least is somewhat at 5'11", 204, maybe a rabbit type. And then Jamon Dumas Johnson. So I haven't looked into many of these for the most part. I know that that's going to be an SEC type of guy for the most part here with Dumas. I'm probably going to be just saying you can flip a coin here and take one of those players. I like your idea of safety, so let's go ahead and look between R.J. Mickens and Crawford as far as for with the coverage snaps. I'll take the slightly larger guy, at least over here in Mickens with that last pick. He'll start on special teams, come back in, and we've got our draft. So let's go ahead and take a look at the analysis we have for the Arizona Cardinals. Starting in the future, right tackle, 2 Ohio State players go early. So for those of you who are Ohio State and Cardinals fans, this has been like the best 3 years of drafting of your life or something. Have another defensive lineman, a linebacker. So you're really hitting the front 7 and getting a right tackle of the future. Nothing wrong with that. You get a ball hawk who's aggressive in Kobe Bryant, and a safety. You don't really address some areas like running back. You don't really address the wide receiver spot. Maybe you end up trading a late round draft pick to see if you can get a shifty guy in the future. But overall, I think at least we got a B+ for everything that's there. We're able to pick up another player. Probably all in a day's work, at least for us here at the Redbird Reboot podcast.
Yeah, I think they've hit some really important areas of need. I think some people might be surprised we didn't go defensive interior early. earlier than we did. But I do kind of have this feeling that that's more likely what we're going to see is somewhere there, like in the third round. And with Tomlinson, it's just kind of developed the guys they've got. We'll see.
Yep.
Maybe they'll prove me
Absolutely.
wrong. I really like the idea of getting a day 2 linebacker. You get you look at a guy like Nick Bolton who just got paid. I think he was a second round pick if I'm not mistaken.
Third round pick actually.
Third round pick.
I think he was taken with the Tyrann Mathieu pick at least for that.
Okay.
Let me take a look here real quick and see the.
So while you're looking for that, when you get those kinds of guys,
second round. You're right. He was in the second round.
Day 2 linebackers, because it's a position that doesn't usually go in the first round. I know our Steve Keim experience has kind of given us a skewed perception of that, but when you're getting a second round linebacker, you're often getting a guy who has Pro Bowl potential. Like that. Those are the top linebackers in most drafts. So it's a non-premium position. That's why, right? As they talk about, but having one guy who just on year 2 or 3 becomes just a really stud player at that position potentially is really appealing to me.
Yep. Kind of went with the strategy Drew McWhorter talked about, taking Simmons or Jackson, compete with Adams for right guard 1. I think Simmons would probably not play till later in the season, so you could keep him at tackle and then move them to tackle next year. A long-term approach is basically what we did in this draft. Well, Joe, thanks again so much. We've been here for about 2 hours or so at least. We want to make sure and thank you for the time. We'll probably split this into 2 podcast episodes, with one going over just the draft talent and then one just covering our mock draft. Where can our viewers find you and find your content as well, so that we're able to make sure we keep up with the old Cardinal rule?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at Comeau13, as you see right there. I too am on Blue Sky. I think we're following each other, aren't we, Blake?
I think we are. I just have to download it back to my phone. I had to clean some stuff up off my phone, and that ended up getting pushed off.
And I am following you on Blue Sky, I believe. Yes, we're following each other.
Yeah.
And are you not following me back? You need to download that file.
Oh, I know. I need to get that back at least when I can.
But it's josephcomeau.bluesky.social. And then obviously the Cardinal rule. We were talking about that before we went live. I'm got a community of folks that we're starting to kind of get in there doing content there, kind of reconfiguring it. But on YouTube at the Cardinal rule is another place to find me.
Yeah, fantastic. Hey guys, we've been here for just a nice long 2 hours. We've got a bunch of content today. This has been the Redbird Reboot podcast. As you can hear, my dog in the background is already crying. He wants to be able to be done with this podcast at long last. So we'll call it there. You guys have been rebooted. Good luck and take care. Go Arizona Cardinals fans.
Peace.